Douma retaken by Syrian forces. What does this change here?
Well, immediately, militarily on the ground, it's the final sort of capstone in Bashar Assad's, if you want to say, endgame in this war, with the staunch backing through most of it, of Iran and Russia. What it really does is it stamps out the last, and I have to say, urban bastion of rebel resistance. It marks the end of any effective rebel opposition in a major populated urban area. Yes, there are still pockets, very, very sparse, in other parts of Syria, but most, if not all, of the remaining rebels, at least in the Douma area, have now evacuated, where they're all sort of being amalgamated in sort of a last pocket in Idlib in the northwest of Syria. Look, what we've seen is, if you want to sort of sum it up, is the same pattern, perhaps even more ferocious if that's possible, of these long sieges that we've seen throughout the war. Beginning, you go all the way back to 2013-14 of Homs. You could then look at Aleppo, which was notorious until now, December 2016. Several other small towns which had been rebel pockets of resistance south of Damascus, a couple of years back. And in each case, we've seen a similar, if not exactly cookie-cutter pattern of sieges in which civilian populations were often cut off from necessary medical supplies, accusations against the regime of using essentially starvation as a weapon of war, weaponizing the lack of food, essentially, and then leading to a point at which, after extensive bombardment, remember the siege of this particular suburb of Damascus had been going on for years. The most ferocious endgame phase of it was really in the past several weeks, couple of months, where we have seen absolutely ferocious bombardment, and if you are to believe the reports, and there's no reason not to, of human rights organizations, journalists, residents, observers on the ground, these bombardments have been marked at times by the use of cluster bombs, barrel bombs. We talk a lot about chemical weapons because they seize the headlines, grab the world's attention. The fact of the matter is, though, at the end of the day, this has been a campaign where the bulk of the people, hundreds of thousands, by most counts, UN counts, have been killed by conventional means of war, artillery bombardments and other non-chemical means of killing. The Syrian forces are not going to enter Douma, at least according to the government right now. There's been no official declaration from the Syrian government. This is all according, as you noted, to the Russian military right now. They're going to have police eventually enter the enclave. There are supposedly, reportedly, some rebels left there. The leaders of the last rebel group, Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, have evacuated. That's all we really know for now.
Doug, I want to move away from the events on the ground to the international players. Of course, we heard from the French president earlier, Emmanuel Macron, saying that we now have proof. Of course, these allegations are going to be denied by the Kremlin.
You know, denied by the Kremlin, and now the Kremlin, going back to my previous answer about Douma and what does this mean, essentially, the fall of it? Well, it now means that the Syrian government and the Russian military have control of the narrative over what happened in Douma. And why do I say that? I say that because they literally are surrounding the city and now control access in and out of that city in the absence of others. There have been media reports of the chemical weapons inspectors. We've reported already that the chemical watchdog, the OPCW, they are expected to deploy shortly. I don't have an exact timeline in Douma to try to get down to the work. Time is running out. If, as is widely suspected, chlorine, people say, was used, some other nerve agent, possibly sarin, also used. That's banned by war. In order to really ascertain and get to the bottom of responsibility, try to attribute responsibility, find if and when and how it was used, that you need within a week or so, 10 days at the most chemical weapons experts will tell you. So there's a race against time now between those on the ground in Douma who want to control that narrative, and I'm going out on a limb, this is speculation, and the chemical weapons inspectors who want to get as many bodies out of there as they can quickly through whatever porous breaks they still have to get them out so they can examine them and ascertain what happened before they no longer have access, before perhaps all those traces disappear. So right now, that is an absolutely critical aspect of what happens next here in the phases of planning.
And Doug, I want to move on to a point that we heard from our correspondent Philip Crowther in Washington only moments ago, saying that Washington and Moscow are now trying to make sure that they don't go head-to-head in this conflict. Is that possible?
Well, Is it possible? Yes. But obviously, we've seen a lot of rhetoric, and we just heard Philip report that, as often happens, almost inevitably happens in the case of Trump tweeting in diplomacy, he'll dial down. He will, if not back down entirely, he will change the narrative dramatically on the next day or within even hours after tweeting the original thing. And that's what's happening in this case. There are obviously, as we've heard the reporting, the administration, the Pentagon have their imperatives. They are trying to come up with realistic military options. You can argue they're all bad options, but that is their job as generals and military planners. Come up what should be done next, what are the president's options. As they do that right now, and they're looking at a smaller and smaller window right now, one of their major preoccupations is making sure that the Russians or Russian forces or Russian equipment are not hit. We heard the bellicose rhetoric yesterday, the Russians saying they will shoot down any incoming U.S. missile and also target the launch sites of any such missiles. Very bellicose rhetoric, and I get a sense the day later, both sides are trying to draw back from that brink, trying to take a deep breath. We saw last year in the aftermath of the chemical attack in Han Shekun when Donald Trump had his one-off military action, launching the Tomahawk cruise missiles, there was a so-called deconfliction mechanism put in place there, a warning to the Russians so that they could get their forces out of harm's way before that attack. That hotline, according to reports, the Kremlin says, is still in existence, still presumably being used at this hour. And we have had a lot of reports in the past few days, unconfirmed. The New York Times among the ones reporting that both Syrian forces have been moving arms, men, and materiel, military material on aircraft to Latakia, where the Russians have their air base, presumably to get them out of harm's way. That's part of deconfliction. I would say that the U.S. and France, if it eventually joins, will give a warning to the Russians, but they will do so at the very last minute, probably, so that the Russians don't have enough time to then warn Bashar Assad.
Add to that the other international player, Iran, saying they will stand by Syria and intervene if there is a strike. Doug Herbert, thank you for that analysis.